Hey everyone, and welcome to this episode of The History Reader. In today's episode, we're going to be talking about biographies. It's kind of no secret on this channel that I am a massive fan of reading biographies. It's really what I default to when I'm looking for a new book. I'll drift over to the section of the bookstore or the library or the section of the website that has biographies on it. I really enjoy reading them. I feel comfortable reading them. And so because the History Challenge bingo board has one of the squares for biography or memoirs, I thought that I would use today's video to give some recommendations for some good biographies that could fit into the History Challenge prompt. Now, biography is very wide-ranging. And that's something I want to get across today, is that you don't have to think of biography as a dusty old book telling you the story from cradle to grave of some boring political figure. There are those types of biographies, and I'll give some recommendations for those at the end of this video. But that's not the extent of what biography can do. So the first type of biography I want to tell you about is one where you don't necessarily have to see somebody's whole life. You can take a portion of somebody's life and you can tell a story that may be wider than that person using that person's experiences. The perfect example of this is Ben Macintyre's book, The Spy and the Traitor. This came out, I believe, last year or maybe the year before, maybe 2019. And it is probably one of my favorite books that I've ever read. It is a biography, effectively, of a guy named Oleg Gordievsky, who was a KGB spy who was then turned by MI6, the British Foreign Intelligence Service, to spy on the Russians or the Soviet Union. And I don't want to give too much away because it's one of the most insane stories I've ever read, fiction or non-fiction. It sounds like something that could come out of a John le Carré book, and it's just incredible. It's like, I don't actually have a copy of it. I read it as an ebook, and then I've actually bought the audiobook and I listen to it when I go to sleep and stuff because it's just such a fascinating story. And it's so well written. It's not that long, maybe a few hundred pages. Again, I don't have a physical copy, so I don't actually know how long it is in pages, but it's a fascinating book. You get an insight into how espionage works, how the Cold War, some of the politics of the Cold War, sort of how the Downing Street and the White House got involved in all this espionage and how these networks spread across the world. And it's through the lens of this guy who, he was a very important spy, but he's kind of a minor player in all these world events. And you get to experience those world events through him. So that's the first type of biography. The second type of biography I want to talk about is one that focuses not on a single person, but on a group of people or a family or a dynasty or something like that. It's a way of writing biography that allows you to see how one group of people may have either influenced history in some way or been influenced by history or some way, or just gone along for the ride in history in some way. And there are huge numbers of these biographies. Any biography of a royal family, for example, fits in here. Like a history of a royal family is really a series of biographies. I have a couple here that I want to talk about, and they are from an author who I really love. He is probably one of the best biographers around at the moment. His name is Ron Chernow. And he actually wrote and published Alexander Hamilton biography, which this doesn't fit into this category, but definitely if this is something you're interested in, pick it up and read it. So he wrote the Alexander Hamilton biography, which Lin-Manuel Miranda used as inspiration for the Hamilton musical, and Ron Chernow actually consulted during the production of the musical as a historical consultant. He is an excellent biographer. He's written on George Washington, he's written on Ulysses S. Grant, he's written on John D. Rockefeller, and he's also written these biographies here. This one is called The Warburgs, and this is the House of Morgan. I'll talk about the House of Morgan because I know it best. It focuses on the banking family headed by John Pierpont Morgan, or J.P. Morgan. We know that name today as a bank, and that is J.P. Morgan's bank. There is also Morgan Stanley, which is, you learn about in the book, an offshoot of the Morgan Bank. Back then, it was known as either the House of Morgan or the Morgan Bank, and it was the Morgan name that was really important. He eventually would pass the control of the bank over to his son, Jack Pierpont Morgan, so J.P. Morgan Jr. effectively. And this book is a history of that. You get to see the world, the American financial world, develop through the eyes of some of the major players in that story. You get to see the development of the Federal Reserve, the trust-busting 1929 Wall Street crash, all of these sorts of things, both world wars and how they were financed, and how the world shifted from being centered on London, financially centered on London, to being financially centered on New York. And so it's a fascinating way to learn about something that can be quite dry. I mean, I don't know if they're in shot here, but I've got a 3-volume history of the Federal Reserve, which tells the same story broadly, but not in a way that's not nearly as engaging. So that's another way you could read biography. You could look for histories of families. I have a couple other recommendations here for that. There is a 2-volume history of the House of Rothschild by Neil Ferguson. I believe in some countries this has been published as a single volume. I think it's called Money's Profits, which is what the first volume here is called. This is what it says on the tin. It's a history of the Rothschild banking dynasty. So if you're into that, you could read that. There's also a really excellent book by Simon Sebag Montefiore called The Romanovs, and this is about the Romanov royal family of Russia and their dynasty. And so it starts in, it's been a long time since I knew anything about this. The Romanovs come to power in the 1500s, I believe, 1500s or 1600s, and follows them all the way through to the Russian Revolution. So again, it's not a biography of a single person. You could go and find the biographies of each of these people and learn that history. But in here, you basically get 50 to 100 pages worth of biography for each of the Tsars and Tsarinas. So that is another excellent way of approaching things. The last type of biography that I'm going to talk about is the classic biography of a political figure. Generally from more modern history, you're going to find these in serious detail. The closer you get to sort of the modern day people, the longer these biographies get. For example, Ian Kershaw has written a biography of Hitler. This is the single volume, which runs to about 1,000 pages. There is also a 2-volume version of this, which runs to about 1,800 pages or 1,900 pages. Stephen Kotkin's Stalin, this is the 2nd volume here, which is again very long, and there is a 3rd volume to come. This runs to about 1,000 pages. The first volume runs to about the same, and I assume the 3rd volume is going to be very similar. Andrew Roberts is quite good at writing a single volume biography of political figures. He's written this one on Churchill, which is really excellent. He's written one on Napoleon. If you are interested in Napoleon, he's written this, Napoleon the Great, which again, it's quite long. It's 900 pages or so. There are many of these biographies I would recommend. Napoleon, I'd recommend the Churchill one. I'd recommend Hitler. If you're interested in Hitler, I'd recommend reading this one. It's the best one you're going to find. There are so many of these biographies you can read, but hopefully what I've got across here is that you don't have to start with these types of biographies. There are so many out there, like the Ben McIntyre one, and he's got a range of biographies on all sorts of topics. Kim Philby's a good one. So if you want to learn about different topics, biography is a really great way of doing it, and you don't have to pull out the 1,000-page or 3,000-page biographies of people to do that. So I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you got some recommendations, and I will see you soon. Goodbye.